Texas, 1875. The dust-choked streets of Copper Creek had seen better days. Once a promising boomtown nestled at the edge of unforgiving prairie, it now clung to existence like a man dangling from a cliff, desperate and with failing grip. Yet for Dawson Price, this forgotten corner of creation was the perfect place to lose himself among the other broken souls who wandered west seeking anonymity or absolution. At 25, Dawson had already lived several lifetimes worth of trouble. The war had taken his youth, the years after had hardened what remained. His handsome features, strong jaw dusted with light stubble, piercing blue eyes that caught the Texas sun, belied the wariness that settled into his bones. Despite his athletic frame and the natural ease with which he moved, Dawson carried himself like a man constantly prepared to draw or run. "Another," he said, sliding his empty whiskey glass across the scarred bar top. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered leather, poured without comment. The Rusty Spur Saloon existed for men like Dawson, those needing a place where questions weren't asked and pasts weren't discussed. Dawson stared into his glass, contemplating the amber liquid. 5 years since Appomattox and he was still running, not from the law but from connection, from the possibility that someone might come to rely on him, might need him. That was a responsibility he couldn't bear again. Not after Chancellorsville, not after watching most of his company die in that hellish thicket, men whose faces still haunted his dreams. "The frontier ain't for the soft-hearted," his father had told him before Dawson rode west. "Out there, a man survives by keeping to himself and trusting no one." Those words had become his gospel. The West was no place for love or friendship, only survival. Survival meant independence, and independence meant loneliness. That was the price of staying alive in a land where nature and man conspired daily to kill you. The batwing doors of the saloon swung open, allowing harsh sunlight to spill across the floorboards. The piano player faltered mid-note as every eye turned toward the newcomer. "Get her out of here," the barkeep growled. 2 men dragged a young woman into the saloon, her struggling barely noticeable against their firm grip. Her dress, once a fine blue calico, was torn and soiled. Long blonde hair fell in tangles around a face that, though dirty and bruised along one cheekbone, still commanded attention with its delicate beauty. "Found this one trying to steal a horse," said the larger man, a bulldog of a human with small, cruel eyes. "Figured Sheriff Turner might want to know before we handle it our way." The woman, barely more than a girl of 19 or 20, lifted her chin. "I wasn't stealing, I was taking back what's rightfully mine." Her voice carried the hint of an Eastern education beneath the terror, and Dawson found himself watching despite his determination to mind his own business. "Worthless liar," spat the second man, "probably one of them fallen women from Fort Worth come to work the camps." "I most certainly am not," she replied, indignation momentarily overriding her fear. The larger man's hand connected with her face, sending her sprawling to the dusty floor. "Shut your mouth, girl. Women like you are all the same, worthless except for one thing." Something in Dawson's chest tightened, a feeling so long dormant he barely recognized it. Righteous anger, he'd seen enough innocent suffering during the war to last several lifetimes. Before he could reconsider, he was on his feet. "That's enough." His voice cut through the room like a knife. All heads turned toward him. The saloon fell silent except for the woman's ragged breathing. "This ain't your business, stranger," the bulldog man said, hand hovering near his pistol. Dawson took a casual sip of whiskey, though every muscle in his body had tensed for fight or flight. "Maybe not. But I've never been fond of watching 2 grown men beat on a woman half their size." "She's a horse thief." "So you say," Dawson set down his glass. "Sheriff can sort that out." "No need for additional persuasion." The second man stepped forward, revealing a deputy's badge. "I am the law here, friend." Dawson smiled without humor. "Then you should know better." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then the woman spoke, her voice steadier than before. "My name is Penelope Vaughn. My father was Judge Hiram Vaughn of Boston. I have papers to prove my identity." The name seemed to give the deputy pause. "Judge Vaughn. The one who bought the old Jenkins place last year." "Yes," she struggled to her feet, dignity somehow intact despite her disheveled appearance. "He died 3 months ago. The ranch is mine now, including that horse." The deputy exchanged looks with his companion. Judge died of fever weeks back, he confirmed. But that don't explain why you're dressed like that or why you were sneaking around instead of just claiming your property proper. Penelope's gaze dropped momentarily. I arrived yesterday on the eastbound stage. When I went to the ranch, I found it occupied by these men who claimed my father sold it before his death. They took my papers, my luggage, everything. When I tried to go to town for help, they locked me in the root cellar. I escaped this morning. Dawson watched the men's faces carefully. The slight shift in their expressions told him everything he needed to know. Sounds like we have a misunderstanding, the deputy said smoothly. Why don't we take Miss Vaughn back to the ranch to sort this out? I think not, Dawson interjected. Seems to me the lady should speak with Sheriff Turner directly. The actual sheriff. The deputy's hand moved to his gun. You calling me a liar, mister? In one fluid motion born of hard experience, Dawson's revolver appeared in his hand. I'm suggesting we all take a pleasant walk to the sheriff's office, where Miss Vaughn can tell her story properly. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the timely arrival of an older man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Turner took in the scene with the weary expression of someone who had seen it all before. What's this about, Wilkins? He asked the deputy. The story unfolded again, this time with the sheriff asking pointed questions that made the deputy increasingly uncomfortable. By the end, Sheriff Turner had a grim set to his mouth. Miss Vaughn, I'm sorry for your troubles. I knew your father, good man. Been wondering why I hadn't heard from the new owner he supposedly sold to. He turned to the deputy. Wilkins, consider yourself relieved of duty pending investigation. And Miller, he addressed the bulldog man, I suggest you vacate the Vaughn property immediately. As the two men slunk away with murderous backward glances, the sheriff turned to Dawson. Appreciate your intervention, Mr. Price. Dawson Price. Well, Mr. Price, you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest. Those men have friends, the sheriff sighed. Miss Vaughn, I'll need to verify your documents, which means retrieving them from your property. In the meantime, you'll need somewhere safe to stay. Before Dawson could protest, the sheriff continued, Mr. Price here seems capable. Perhaps he could escort you to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. And just like that, Dawson found himself responsible for a woman he'd never met, contradicting everything he believed about keeping to himself in this unforgiving territory. But something about Penelope Vaughn's determined dignity despite her circumstances made it impossible to refuse. Fine, he said curtly, holstering his weapon, but just to the boarding house. As they stepped into the harsh sunlight, Dawson couldn't help but notice how Penelope's hair caught the light like spun gold, or how she walked with her shoulders back despite everything she'd endured. She was Eastern softness wrapped around a core of surprising steel, a combination as intriguing as it was dangerous to a man determined to avoid entanglements. Little did he know that this simple act of reluctant decency would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival on the frontier, about his capacity for connection, and about the true meaning of treasure in a land where gold was measured in dust and blood. Thank you, Penelope said quietly as they walked the dusty street. You didn't have to help me. No, Dawson agreed, eyes scanning for danger. I didn't. What he couldn't explain was why he had. Penelope's first impression of Dawson Price was that of a typical Western man, hard, distant, dangerous when provoked. But as they walked toward the boarding house, she noticed other details. The way he positioned himself between her and the street, the respectful distance he maintained, the occasional glance to ensure she was keeping pace despite her exhaustion. Have you been in Copper Creek long? She asked, attempting conversation. Long enough. His answers were clipped, discouraging further questions. I suppose I should tell you I have no money to pay you for your trouble, she admitted. Everything I brought was taken. Dawson's stride faltered for just a moment. I'm not looking for payment. Nevertheless, I'm in your debt. They reached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, a neat two-story structure that stood out among the weathered buildings of Copper Creek. Before Dawson could knock, Penelope touched his arm lightly. Mr. Price, those men will come back, she said, her blue eyes serious in her bruised face. I have no illusions about that. Something in her directness struck him. This was no helpless damsel, despite her circumstances. She was assessing her situation with clear-eyed practicality. Probably, he admitted. I need to secure my father's property, it's all I have left in the world, but I can't do it alone. She took a deep breath. Would you consider employment? I can pay you once I access my father's accounts. Dawson almost refused outright. Getting involved in local disputes was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd avoided for years. But the alternative was leaving her to face those men alone, and something about that prospect sat uneasily in his conscience. I'll think about it, he said finally, which was more consideration than he'd given any proposition in recent memory. Mrs. Holloway, a bustling widow with sharp eyes and a kind heart, took one look at Penelope and ushered her inside, clucking disapprovingly at her state. She cast a suspicious glance at Dawson until the sheriff arrived to explain the situation. The poor child can stay as long as needed, Mrs. Holloway declared. As for you, Mr. Price, if you're to be her protector, I expect proper behavior. Dawson suppressed a grimace. I haven't agreed to anything permanent, ma'am. But as he left the boarding house, Dawson knew he was already more involved than he wanted to be. The smart move would be to ride out that night, find another dusty town where no one knew his name or expected anything from him. Instead, he found himself at the livery stable, examining his horse's shoes and ensuring his tack was in good repair, just in case. The following morning, Sheriff Turner knocked on Dawson's door at the small hotel where he'd been staying. Thought you'd want to know, the sheriff said without preamble. I rode out to the Vaughn place last night. Found it empty, but signs of hasty departure. No sign of the lady's papers or belongings. Dawson leaned against the doorframe. And Wilkins. Missing along with Miller and a few other unsavory characters. The sheriff's expression was grave. They'll be back once they gather enough men. That property's worth something, good water, decent grazing. Judge Vaughn paid fair money for it. Not my problem, Dawson said automatically. Sheriff Turner regarded him steadily. Miss Vaughn mentioned you might help her secure her property. She's mistaken. Is she? The older man sighed. Look, Price, I don't know your story and I don't need to, but that girl has no one. Her father was well respected, did right by folks around here. Seems to me his daughter deserves the same chance. Dawson remained silent. Think on it, the sheriff said, turning to leave. Meanwhile, I've sent word to the circuit judge, but he won't be through for at least 2 weeks. Until then, the lady's in limbo and danger. After the sheriff left, Dawson sat heavily on his bed. 5 years of drifting, of carefully avoiding any connection deeper than a shared bottle or a card game. 5 years of keeping his gun oiled and his heart locked away. One day in Copper Creek had already threatened that careful isolation. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw Penelope Vaughn's face, bruised but unbowed, frightened but facing her fears with remarkable composure. The frontier chewed up Eastern transplants like her daily, especially women alone. She wouldn't last a month without help, not my concern, he told himself firmly. The West was no place for misplaced chivalry. Out here, sentiment got you killed. He was packing his saddlebags when a commotion in the street drew him to the window. Penelope stood outside the general store, face to face with a rough-looking cowhand. Even from a distance, Dawson could see her spine was straight, her posture defiant despite the obvious intimidation. Without conscious decision, he was moving, taking the hotel stairs 2 at a time. By the time he reached the street, a small crowd had gathered. Don't care who your daddy was, the cowhand was saying, tobacco juice staining his unkempt beard. Wilkins says you're nothing but trouble, and he aims to settle it permanent. Mr. Wilkins has stolen my property and my identification papers, Penelope replied, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. If he has grievances, he can address them to the proper authorities. The cowhand spat near her feet. Proper authorities? Lady, this ain't Boston. Out here, authority comes from who's holding the gun. Is that so? Dawson's voice cut through the tension as he approached, hand resting casually near his holster. Then I suggest you consider who's holding this one. The cowhand turned, sizing up Dawson with a calculating squint. Whatever he saw made him reconsider his position. With a final glare at Penelope, he retreated toward the saloon. Are you following me, Mr. Price? Penelope asked, though relief was evident in her expression. Just happened to be passing by. With your hand on your gun. A reluctant half-smile tugged at his mouth. Dangerous town. She studied him for a moment, then gestured to the parcels she'd been carrying before the confrontation. I was attempting to purchase necessities, Mrs. Holloway has been kind enough to advance me credit until my situation is resolved. Dawson nodded, then surprised himself by asking, "Need help carrying those?" They walked back toward the boarding house in silence, but it felt less strained than before. Finally, Penelope spoke, "Have you reconsidered my offer?" He should refuse. Every instinct honed by years of lonely survival screamed at him to walk away. Instead, he found himself saying, "What exactly would this job entail?" Hope flickered in Penelope's eyes. "I need to reclaim my father's ranch and make it viable. That means securing the property, recovering my documents, and then learning how to manage it." "You're planning to stay. Run the ranch yourself?" Dawson couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. Ladies from Boston didn't run Texas cattle operations. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "My father's estate in Boston was sold to cover his debts. This ranch is my inheritance and my future. It's hard country for anyone, let alone a woman." She finished his sentence with a raised eyebrow. "Perhaps, but I'm a quick study, Mr. Price, and I'm more resilient than I appear." Looking at her determined expression, Dawson believed it. Still, the idea was madness. "You'd need more than just me. A ranch takes hands, equipment. One challenge at a time. First, I need to establish my legal claim and secure the property. Will you help me?" Against all reason, against years of careful isolation, against his firmly held belief that attachment was a weakness the frontier would exploit, Dawson heard himself say, "I'll help you get your property back and secured. After that, we'll see." The smile that transformed Penelope's face made something long dormant stir in Dawson's chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he nearly mistook it for indigestion. "Thank you," she said. "We'll leave as soon as possible." "Tomorrow morning," he agreed. "I'll gather supplies." As he walked away, Dawson wondered what madness had possessed him. He was riding toward trouble instead of away from it, involving himself in someone else's fight, risking his carefully maintained solitude. Yet he couldn't deny a strange lightness in his step, as if by agreeing to help Penelope Vaughn, he'd set down a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. Dawn broke over the eastern horizon as Dawson waited outside the boarding house with 2 saddled horses. He'd spent the previous afternoon and evening making preparations, purchasing supplies, studying the crude map Sheriff Turner had provided of the Vaughn property, and cleaning his weapons with meticulous care. When Penelope emerged, Dawson barely recognized her. Gone was the torn calico dress. Instead, she wore a divided riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a simple blouse with a jacket suitable for the trail. Her golden hair was braided and pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She carried a small bundle of belongings borrowed from Mrs. Holloway. "Will I do?" she asked, noting his surprise. "You look," Dawson searched for an appropriate word, "practical." A smile touched her lips. "High praise indeed from you, Mr. Price." Despite her composure, Dawson noticed the slight tremble in her hands as he helped her mount. This was no seasoned frontier woman, regardless of her attire or determination. "Can you ride?" he asked belatedly. "I learned as a child in Boston, though I imagine Western riding is somewhat different." "Stay close and you'll be fine," Dawson said, swinging into his own saddle. "The ranch is about 10 miles out. We should reach it by midday." They rode in silence as Copper Creek fell behind them and the vast Texas landscape opened up before them. The late April sun was warm but not yet punishing, and wildflowers dotted the prairie in splashes of color. "It's beautiful," Penelope said after a while, her gaze taking in the rolling terrain. "Different from what I expected." Dawson glanced at her. "What did you expect?" "I'm not entirely sure. Father's letters described it as promising but raw country. I imagine something more barren." "Wait until August," Dawson said dryly. "But yes, this part of Texas has its moments." "How long have you been in the West, Mr. Price?" He considered deflecting the question, but something about the open sky and Penelope's genuine interest loosened his habitual reticence. "Since after the war, about 5 years now." "You fought Confederate cavalry. Not something I advertise in these parts." Penelope nodded thoughtfully. My father was a staunch Unionist, but he never vilified Southern soldiers. He said most were just men caught in circumstances beyond their control. The observation startled Dawson with its accuracy. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, sadness flitted across her features, though perhaps not wise enough to avoid the financial troubles that sent him west in his final years. They continued writing, the conversation flowing more naturally than Dawson would have expected. Penelope asked thoughtful questions about the terrain, the wildlife, the challenges of ranching in this region. Her intelligence was evident, as was her determination to understand the land she had inherited. By midday they crested a gentle rise and the Vaughn ranch came into view in the valley below. It was modest by Texas standards, a sturdy main house, a barn, corrals and outbuildings spread across a tract of land bordered by a creek that sparkled in the sunlight. Penelope drew her horse to a halt, drinking in the sight. "So this is it," she said softly, "my father's final home." Dawson studied the property with a more tactical eye. No sign of occupation, he noted. "But that doesn't mean it's empty. How should we proceed?" Her deference to his judgment was both gratifying and uncomfortable. Dawson wasn't accustomed to being responsible for anyone's safety but his own. "We'll approach carefully. I'll check the buildings while you stay mounted and ready to ride if there's trouble." The property appeared deserted as they rode into the yard, but Dawson remained vigilant. He dismounted in front of the main house, gesturing for Penelope to stay with the horses. "Wait here." The front door stood partially open. Dawson drew his revolver and pushed it wider with his boot, senses alert for any sign of ambush. What he found instead was chaos, furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor, a fine layer of dust settling over the destruction. After ensuring all the rooms were clear, he returned to Penelope. "They've ransacked the place, but it's empty now." She dismounted stiffly after the long ride. "May I see?" Dawson watched her face as she took in the state of her inheritance. Determination replaced the momentary shock in her expression. "They were looking for something," she said, surveying the scattered papers and upended furniture. "Probably your father's deed and bank documents." Penelope moved purposefully through the mess, examining certain areas with particular attention. In the study, she paused before a heavy oak desk that had been pried open. "They didn't find everything," she said with quiet satisfaction, kneeling to run her fingers along the underside of the desk. With a soft click, a hidden compartment opened, revealing a small leather portfolio. "Father always did prefer the classics when it came to hiding valuables," she explained, withdrawing the portfolio. Inside were several documents, including the deed to the property in Judge Hiram Vaughn's name and a letter addressed to Penelope. While she read the letter, Dawson continued his inspection of the property, checking the barn and outbuildings. The livestock was gone, likely stolen by Wilkins and his companions, but the structures themselves were sound. With work and investment, the ranch could be viable. When he returned to the house, he found Penelope had begun straightening the main room, her movements purposeful despite the enormity of the task. "We shouldn't stay the night," Dawson cautioned. "Wilkins and his men could return at any time." Penelope looked up, her expression resolute. "I'm not leaving, Mr. Price. This is my home now. I've found the deed and my father's banking papers. I have legal proof of ownership." "Legal proof won't stop a bullet," Dawson countered. "No, but it gives me the right to defend my property," she gestured around them. "If I leave now, I might never get another chance to reclaim what's mine." Dawson recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. "At least let me check the perimeter, make sure we can secure the place for the night." As dusk approached, they had managed to restore some order to the main room and kitchen. Penelope had found provisions in the root cellar that had escaped the raiders' attention, and she prepared a simple meal while Dawson reinforced doors and windows. They ate by lamplight, the darkness beyond the windows absolute except for the silver of a quarter moon rising over the eastern horizon. "What did your father's letter say?" Dawson asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Penelope's expression softened. "He knew he was dying when he wrote it. He apologized for leaving me with so little after the Boston creditors were paid, but said he hoped this land would give me a new start." She paused. "He also warned me about Wilkins. Apparently, my father caught him stealing from the ranch accounts shortly before his death. That explains Wilkins' determination to claim this place. He needs to cover his theft. Yes, Penelope met his gaze across the table, which also means he won't simply give up. Dawson nodded grimly. We'll need to bring in the law. Once your ownership is established, Wilkins becomes nothing but a common thief. And if the law fails? The question hung between them, laden with implications. Finally, Dawson said, then we handle it another way. Penelope held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Price, and for your help today. She hesitated, then added, I know this isn't what you planned when you intervened at the saloon. Something about her directness, her lack of pretense, made Dawson more forthcoming than usual. Plans change, that's one thing the frontier teaches you quick. What was your plan before meeting me? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Dawson considered the question, didn't really have one. Just passing through like always. You've been passing through for 5 years. Her insight was uncomfortably accurate. Moving keeps things simple. Or perhaps, Penelope ventured, it prevents anything from becoming complicated, like connections, relationships. Dawson stiffened. The frontier's no place for those luxuries. Is that what you believe? That human connection is a luxury rather than a necessity. Out here, yes, he stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. We should get some rest, I'll take first watch. Penelope didn't press the issue, but as she retired to her father's bedroom, the only one with an intact door, Dawson could feel her words lingering in the air like smoke after a gunshot. He'd spent years convincing himself that isolation was strength, that needing no one was the ultimate security. Why, then, did her simple question make him feel as though he was the one who had been robbed? The night passed without incident, but dawn brought new challenges. A thorough inventory of the property revealed the extent of their predicament: no livestock except for their 2 horses, limited supplies, and a water pump that needed repair. The spring planting season was already underway across the region, but the Vaughn fields lay fallow. We need to get to town, Dawson said as they surveyed the empty corrals. You need supplies, hands to work the place, and most importantly, legal protection. Penelope nodded, but her determination hadn't wavered. I'll need to access my father's bank account in Copper Creek. According to his papers, there should be enough to get started. They were preparing to ride to town when dust on the horizon caught Dawson's attention. Riders were approaching, at least 4, moving with purpose. Inside, he ordered, drawing Penelope toward the house. Stay away from the windows. He positioned himself near the front window, revolver ready, as the riders drew closer. Through his field glasses, he identified Wilkins among them. It's them, he confirmed grimly. Penelope's face paled, but her voice remained steady. What will they do? Try to scare us off first. If that fails, he let the implication hang. We have the legal documents now, she reminded him. Men like that don't care about paper. The riders reined in about 50 yards from the house. Wilkins dismounted and stepped forward, hand resting ostentatiously on his pistol. Come on out, Miss Vaughn, he called. We need to discuss your trespassing on my property. Dawson placed a restraining hand on Penelope's arm as she moved toward the door. Let me handle this. He stepped onto the porch, keeping his body angled to present a smaller target, his right hand loose and ready near his holster. Morning, Wilkins, he called. Seems there's some confusion about ownership here. Wilkins spat into the dust. No confusion. Judge Vaughn sold me this spread before he died, got the bill of sale to prove it. Funny thing about that, Dawson replied. Miss Vaughn has the original deed and her father's personal papers, no mention of any sale. Maybe the old man forgot to update his papers. Don't matter now, this is my land and you're both trespassing. Sheriff Turner might see it differently. Wilkins laughed an ugly sound. Turner's just one man with a town to watch. Out here, who do you think folks will believe? A local deputy or some Eastern girl claiming inheritance? The law's the law, Dawson said evenly. Law, Wilkins gestured expansively. Look around you, Price. You see any law out here except what we make ourselves? One of the riders shifted nervously. Wilkins, maybe we should. "Shut up," Wilkins snapped. To Dawson he continued, "I'm feeling generous today. You and the girl have 1 hour to clear out. After that, we can't be responsible for accidents." With that thinly veiled threat, the men wheeled their horses around and rode a short distance away, making camp just within sight of the house, a clear message that they weren't leaving. Inside, Penelope was waiting, her face composed despite the danger. "They're not going to simply ride away, are they?" Dawson shook his head. "No, and we can't hold them off indefinitely." "What do we do?" For a moment, Dawson considered his options. The smart play would be to leave, ride hard for town, and bring back the sheriff. But that would mean abandoning the ranch, and he suspected Wilkins would burn it to the ground rather than risk losing his claim. "One of us needs to get to town," he said finally. "Bring back Turner and as many men as he can gather." Penelope nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll go, you're the better shot if it comes to defense." The offer surprised him. "It's dangerous. They might follow you." "I'm faster on horseback than I look," she said with unexpected confidence. "Father made sure I could ride properly, even if it wasn't considered entirely ladylike in Boston society." Dawson studied her, reassessing his initial impression of Eastern fragility. "You'll need to leave from the back of the property, follow the creek bed to avoid being seen, then cut east toward town." She nodded, memorizing his instructions. "How long will you be able to hold them off?" "Long enough," he assured her, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. They prepared quickly, gathering the legal documents and essentials Penelope would need. As she mounted her horse at the back door, sheltered from view of Wilkins' camp, Dawson found himself reluctant to let her go. "Be careful," he said, unaccustomed to the concern in his own voice. Penelope looked down at him, her blue eyes reflecting the morning sunlight. "You as well, Mr. Price. I would be very cross if you got yourself killed defending my property." The hint of humor in her voice, despite their dire situation, stirred something in Dawson's chest. Without thinking, he reached up and squeezed her hand where it held the reins. "Dawson," he said, "if we're facing death together, you might as well use my given name." A smile touched her lips. "Penelope, then," her expression grew serious. "I'll be back with help as quickly as possible, Dawson." With that, she urged her horse forward, keeping low in the saddle as she followed the creek bed away from the ranch. Dawson watched until she disappeared from sight, then turned back to the house to prepare for what might be the longest day of his life. The standoff continued through the morning. Wilkins and his men maintained their position, occasionally shouting taunts or threats toward the house. Dawson moved between windows, making his presence known without exposing himself unnecessarily. By midday, the tension had escalated. Two of Wilkins' men began approaching the barn, clearly intending to search it. "That's close enough," Dawson called, firing a warning shot that kicked up dust near their feet. The men scrambled back to the safety of their camp, but Wilkins' response was immediate, a volley of gunfire that splintered the window frame near Dawson's position. The message was clear: this would end in blood. As afternoon wore on, Dawson rationed his ammunition carefully, taking shots only when absolutely necessary to maintain the perimeter. He wondered how far Penelope had gotten, whether she'd reached Copper Creek safely, whether help would arrive in time. The thought of her riding alone through potentially hostile territory gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. In just days, she had somehow breached the careful walls he'd built around himself since the war. Her determination, her quiet courage in the face of overwhelming odds, her willingness to fight for what was rightfully hers, all of it resonated with something long buried inside him. A more accurate shot from Wilkins' camp shattered a window, sending glass fragments across the floor. Dawson ducked, then returned fire, satisfied to hear a yelp of pain, not a killing shot but enough to make them more cautious. The exchange initiated a more serious firefight. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the house as Dawson moved from position to position, conserving ammunition while keeping Wilkins and his men pinned down. As dusk approached, Dawson assessed his situation grimly. His ammunition was running low, and Wilkins' men had worked their way closer to the house, using gathering darkness as cover. Soon they would risk a direct assault, and despite his skill, Dawson knew he couldn't hold off 4 determined men indefinitely. He was considering a desperate sortie to the barn for a better defensive position when the distant sound of hoofbeats reached his ears. Lots of hoofbeats. Wilkins heard it too. "What the hell?" his voice carried in the evening air. Riders appeared on the horizon, at least a dozen, moving fast toward the ranch. Leading them was Sheriff Turner, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight, and beside him, her golden hair visible even in the fading light, rode Penelope. Relief flooded through Dawson, followed immediately by concern as Wilkins fired a shot in the direction of the approaching riders. "Hold your fire," Sheriff Turner's voice boomed. "You're surrounded, Wilkins." Indeed, more riders appeared from the east side of the property, ranch hands from neighboring spreads, Dawson realized. Penelope hadn't just brought the sheriff, she'd rallied half the county. Wilkins and his men, recognizing the futility of their position, surrendered with minimal resistance. As Turner's deputies took them into custody, Penelope dismounted and rushed toward the house. Dawson met her at the door, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance and the residual tension humming through his body. "You're alive," she said, relief evident in her voice. "You brought an army," he replied, unable to keep the admiration from his tone. Penelope's smile was tired but triumphant. "Sheriff Turner was quite convincing once I showed him the deed and my father's letter naming Wilkins as a thief." And apparently, several local ranchers had their own grievances with Wilkins' gang. Sheriff Turner joined them, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Miss Vaughn here did more than bring evidence. She convinced the bank to verify her identity based on her father's signature and account details. Then she withdrew enough to offer fair wages to any hands willing to help secure her property." He chuckled. "Half the men in town volunteered once they saw her determination and her inheritance." Penelope blushed slightly. "I simply explained my situation honestly." "Honesty backed by legal ownership and ready cash," Turner added with a wink. "Powerful combination out here." As the sheriff returned to supervise his prisoners, Penelope surveyed the damage to the house. Bullet holes pocked the walls, windows were shattered, and furniture lay splintered from the gunfire. "It can be repaired," Dawson said, following her gaze. "Yes," she agreed, "everything can." She turned to him, her expression serious. "Will you stay, Dawson, at least until the repairs are complete and I have reliable hands hired?" The request was reasonable, practical, yet they both recognized it as something more. An invitation to break his pattern of perpetual movement, to consider putting down roots, however temporarily. The old wariness rose inside him, the instinct to refuse connection, to maintain his isolation as protection against loss. Yet looking at Penelope in the fading light, her face smudged with dust from the hard ride but her eyes bright with triumph and possibility, Dawson found that instinct weaker than before. "I'll stay," he said simply. "Until you're secure here." The smile that illuminated her face made something shift inside him, like ground settling after long drought finally receives rain. Sheriff Turner interrupted their moment. "Miss Vaughn, I've taken the liberty of assigning 2 deputies to remain here tonight as precaution. Tomorrow we'll get a proper crew out to help with repairs and security." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied. "Your assistance has been invaluable." As Turner departed with his prisoners, several volunteers remained behind to help secure the property for the night. Penelope moved among them with natural grace, thanking each man personally, already beginning to establish herself as the rightful mistress of the Vaughn ranch. Watching her, Dawson felt an unfamiliar emotion stirring, something dangerously close to admiration, perhaps even affection. This woman who had arrived in Copper Creek just days ago with nothing, but her name had already begun carving out her place in this harsh territory through sheer force of will and intelligence. For the first time in years, Dawson wondered if his belief about the frontier, that it was no place for connection, might be not just wrong but exactly backward. Perhaps it was precisely in such unforgiving landscapes that human bonds became not luxuries but necessities for survival. It was a dangerous thought for a man who had spent years ensuring he needed no one. More dangerous still was the realization that, as he watched Penelope move competently among the ranch hands, he was beginning to need her. The following weeks transformed the Vaughn ranch. With Penelope's banking access restored and Wilkins awaiting trial in the county seat, work proceeded rapidly. The bullet holes were patched, broken windows replaced, and the water pump repaired. Cattle were purchased from neighboring ranchers to begin restocking the depleted herd, and several experienced hands were hired on permanent basis. Through it all, Dawson remained, finding himself increasingly integral to the operation. His knowledge of cattle and the territory proved invaluable as Penelope learned the business. Each day brought new challenges: fence repairs, livestock decisions, negotiating grazing rights, and each evening found them on the porch, discussing the day's progress as sunset painted the western sky in spectacular colors. "I never understood why Father chose this place," Penelope remarked one such evening, a month after reclaiming the property. "Boston had been our home for generations. But now I begin to see its appeal." Dawson, lounging against the porch rail, followed her gaze across the rolling landscape. "What appeal do you see?" "The possibility of creating something truly your own," she said thoughtfully. "In Boston, everything was predetermined: who you were, who you could become, who you could," she hesitated, "who you could care for." The implication hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge directly. "The frontier has its own rules," Dawson said carefully, "different constraints." "But fewer pretensions," Penelope countered. "Out here, a person is judged by their actions, their character, not their pedigree or social connections." Dawson studied her profile, struck by how at ease she appeared now compared to their first meeting. The bruises had long since faded from her face, and regular outdoor work had brought a healthy glow to her complexion. Her golden hair was braided simply, and her dress, while still modest, was adapted for practicality on the ranch. "You've changed since you arrived," he observed. Penelope smiled. "Is that a compliment or an observation, Mr. Price?" "Both, I suppose." He hesitated, then added, "You belong here more than I would have thought possible." "And you?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "Do you belong here?" The question struck deeper than she could know. For 5 years, Dawson had deliberately avoided belonging anywhere, convinced that attachment was vulnerability. Yet in these weeks at the Vaughn ranch, he'd found himself setting down invisible roots, caring about the outcome of the spring calving, planning improvements to the north pasture, even planting a vegetable garden behind the kitchen. "I don't know," he answered honestly. Penelope held his gaze. "The hands respect you. Sheriff Turner speaks highly of your character, and I—" She paused, gathering courage. "I have come to depend on your presence here." The admission hung between them, an offering Dawson wasn't sure he was ready to accept. "Depending on others is risky," he said, giving voice to the fear that had driven him for years. "People leave. Or die." "Yes," Penelope agreed softly. "Like my father left me, like your comrades in the war." The simple acknowledgement of his unspoken loss startled him. "How did you know about that?" "You call out in your sleep sometimes," she said gently. "The bunkhouse isn't far from the main house." Dawson turned away, uncomfortable with his vulnerability being exposed. "The war was a long time ago. And yet you're still fighting it in your way." Penelope moved closer, not touching him but close enough that he could feel her presence. "Running to avoid loss only guarantees you'll lose everything before it can even begin." The truth of her words struck him with physical force. What had his years of drifting brought him but temporary respite from memories that followed him anyway? What had isolation protected him from except the very connections that might have helped heal those wounds? Before he could formulate a response, one of the ranch hands approached with news of a fence breach in the east pasture. The moment passed, but Penelope's words lingered in Dawson's mind as they rode out to address the problem. That night, alone in the bunkhouse, Dawson faced the questions her observation had raised. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider a different path, one where he stopped running, where he built something lasting, where he allowed himself to need and be needed. The prospect terrified him almost as much as it attracted him. Morning brought news that threatened to resolve his dilemma in the most unwelcome way. A letter arrived from Boston, an offer to purchase the Vaughn ranch at a substantial profit, forwarded by Penelope's former family lawyer. "They want the water rights," she explained as they discussed the letter in the study. "Apparently, the creek on our property is valuable to several business interests expanding westward." Dawson examined the offer. The sum was indeed generous, enough to establish Penelope comfortably anywhere she chose, certainly enough to return to the civilized East if she wished. "Are you considering it?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Penelope was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she gazed out the window at the land she'd fought so hard to claim. "A month ago I might have accepted immediately," she admitted. "When I arrived here I was desperate, alone, terrified. This ranch was simply my inheritance, my only financial security." She turned to face him, "But now it's become my home. These past weeks have taught me that I'm capable of more than I ever imagined in Boston. I've learned to ride properly, to manage accounts, to negotiate with suppliers. I've even learned to shoot, thanks to your instruction." Pride colored her voice and Dawson couldn't help but share it. She had transformed from a displaced Eastern lady to a competent ranch owner with remarkable speed. "So you'll refuse the offer?" Yes, her decision was firm, though I would understand if this changes your plans. Dawson's brow furrowed. "My plans?" "To stay," Penelope clarified. "You agreed to help until I was secure here. With Wilkins awaiting trial and the ranch operational, that condition has been met." She paused, then added quietly, "You're free to move on if that's what you want." The statement was carefully neutral, offering him the escape route he'd always taken before. Yet Dawson detected the subtle hope beneath her words, hope that he might choose differently this time. Before he could respond, the ranch foreman arrived with reports requiring attention, and the conversation was left unresolved. Throughout the day, however, Dawson found himself turning over Penelope's words in his mind. She was right, his stated reason for staying had been fulfilled. By his own pattern, it was time to move on. Yet the thought of leaving the Vaughn ranch, leaving Penelope, created a hollow sensation in his chest he couldn't ignore. That evening, as thunderclouds gathered on the western horizon promising a spring storm, Dawson sought out Penelope. He found her in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal. "Storm's coming," he said by way of greeting. She nodded, closing the stall gate. "Johnson thinks she'll deliver tonight." I wanted to make sure everything was prepared. Dawson leaned against a support beam, watching as Penelope moved with confident familiarity among the horses. "I've been thinking about what you said. About being free to move on." Penelope stilled, her back to him, hands resting on the stall gate. "And have you decided?" The question hung between them, weighted with significance beyond the simple words. Dawson took a deep breath, stepping into unfamiliar territory. "I've spent 5 years believing that the only way to survive out here was to keep moving, to avoid attachment. After the war, after watching men I'd lived alongside for years die in minutes, I convinced myself that caring about anyone or anything was just inviting more pain." Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the barn interior through cracks in the wooden walls. Thunder followed seconds later. "What changed your mind?" Penelope asked quietly, turning to face him. "You," Dawson said simply. "Watching you fight for this place, seeing your determination to build something lasting here despite every obstacle. It made me question whether I've been surviving at all or just existing." Penelope moved closer, her expression open and vulnerable. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That maybe the frontier isn't just about survival. Maybe it's about building something worth surviving for." He met her gaze directly. "I'd like to stay, Penelope, not just until you're secure here, but after." The admission cost him something, the protection of detachment he'd cultivated for years, but the smile that illuminated Penelope's face made the sacrifice worthwhile. "I would like that very much," she said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then, as if nature itself sought to underscore the significance of their exchange, lightning struck somewhere nearby with a deafening crack. The horses whinnied in alarm, and the mare in the birthing stall grew visibly agitated. "She's distressed," Penelope said with concern, moving quickly to the stall. "The storm's frightening her." Dawson joined her, assessing the situation with experienced eyes. Early labor, the storm probably triggered it. The next hours were consumed with helping the mare through a difficult birth. Side by side, Dawson and Penelope worked in seamless coordination, their conversation forgotten in the immediate crisis. When the foal finally emerged, weak but alive, their shared triumph cemented something between them that needed no words. As dawn broke, the storm having passed during the night, they sat together on a hay bale watching the newborn foal take its first wobbly steps. Life finds a way even in the harshest conditions, Penelope observed, exhaustion evident in her voice but satisfaction in her expression. Dawson nodded, acutely aware of her shoulder pressed against his, of the way her golden hair had escaped its braid during the night's efforts, of the competent strength in hands that had once seemed too delicate for ranch work. Penelope, he began, uncertain how to express the feelings that had crystallized during their vigil, last night before the mare. She turned to him, her blue eyes tired but bright with understanding. "I know, Dawson." With a courage that had nothing to do with guns or physical strength, he reached for her hand. "I've been calling you worthless woman in my head sometimes," he admitted. "Not because I believe it, but because that's what Wilkins called you that first day in the saloon, and I keep thinking about how wrong he was." Penelope's fingers tightened around his. "How so?" "You might be the most valuable person I've ever met," Dawson said softly. "You've rebuilt this ranch from nothing, you've faced down thieves and liars without flinching. And you've made me question every belief I've held about surviving alone." The simple honesty of his words seemed to affect Penelope deeply, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I was afraid," she admitted. "When Father died and I learned I would have to come west alone, I thought I would be completely lost here, but then I met you and you helped me find strength I didn't know I possessed." Dawson brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture intimate in the quiet of the early morning barn. "You had that strength all along, I just happened to be there when you discovered it." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer both. When they separated, Dawson saw in Penelope's eyes the same wonder he felt, the recognition that something precious and unexpected had found them both in this unlikely place. "We should probably discuss practical matters," Penelope said after a moment, though her smile belied the businesslike tone. "If you're staying permanently, we should formalize your position here." Dawson chuckled, "Always the judge's daughter. What did you have in mind, foreman, partner?" Penelope's blush was visible even in the dim light of the barn. "I was thinking of a more permanent arrangement, eventually, if you were amenable." The implication was clear, and Dawson found himself uncharacteristically speechless. Marriage had been so far outside his consideration for so long that the prospect both terrified and elated him. "That would be quite the arrangement," he managed finally, "one that would require careful consideration." "Of course," Penelope agreed, her dignity returning despite the intimacy of the moment. "I wouldn't expect an immediate decision. We have time." But as they walked back to the house in the fresh light of morning, Dawson realized that his decision had already been made. The prospect of building a life with Penelope, of transforming the Vaughn ranch into their shared legacy, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before the war. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. Old habits of caution and independence reasserted themselves occasionally, particularly when challenges arose. Summer brought drought conditions that stressed the new herd, and autumn saw a dispute with a neighboring rancher over water access that nearly escalated to violence. Through each crisis, however, Dawson and Penelope worked together, their complementary strengths creating a resilience neither would have achieved alone. Her legal knowledge and diplomatic skills balanced his practical experience and determination. Together, they not only preserved the ranch but began to prosper. By winter, with cattle prices rising and their first successful season behind them, Dawson finally gave voice to the decision he'd made months earlier. On Christmas Eve, with a small tree decorating the parlor and snow falling gently outside, he presented Penelope with a simple gold ring. "I'm not one for fancy speeches," he said as she opened the small box, "but I've spent enough years alone to know the difference between surviving and living. With you, I've remembered how to live again. If you'll have me, I'd like to make that permanent." Penelope's joyful acceptance was followed by a wedding in the spring, a celebration that brought together the community that had first rallied to help her secure her inheritance. Sheriff Turner stood as Dawson's best man, while Mrs. Holloway beamed proudly from the front row, having taken a maternal interest in Penelope from the beginning. As they exchanged vows in the small church in Copper Creek, Dawson reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 5 years of running from connection had ended the moment he'd intervened on behalf of a supposedly worthless woman in a dusty saloon. In helping Penelope claim her inheritance, he had found his own treasure, not in gold or land, but in the love that had transformed them both. The frontier was still harsh, still unforgiving in many ways. But standing beside Penelope as they became husband and wife, Dawson finally understood the truth that had eluded him since the war: survival alone was never enough. It was in building something together, a home, a family, a future, that the true promise of the West was fulfilled. "Mrs. Price," he whispered as they walked back down the aisle together, the name still new and wondrous on his lips. Penelope's smile, radiant and confident, was a far cry from the frightened young woman he'd first encountered. "Mr. Price," she returned, squeezing his hand, "I believe we have a ranch to run." Indeed they did, and a life to build together on the frontier that had once seemed too harsh for love, but which had ultimately proved to be the perfect place for it to flourish.